I believe we first met on Monte Oliveto retreat in 2009 in Italy, where Giovanni was giving great yoga classes every morning. And he dedicated himself to body work, to practicing and teaching body work. But he is also a meditator and longtime member of World Community for Christian Meditation. So welcome, Giovanni. Thank you for your time. Our topic today is body trauma, but let's start here. What is your experience with body work and what is your role in WCCM?
So, first of all, my role in the WCCM or my relationship with the WCCM, I was 27 when I came across meditation. I'm 58 now. And I think, like for a lot of us, that was a wonderful turning moment in my life, because a lot of my religious yearning and my young male yearnings and my yearning to be successful in a career, and also as an artist, they all came together in the simplicity, the wonderful life-giving simplicity of what meditation is about. So I was at university, and I discovered John Main. What was it? My mother actually told me to listen to a talk by Lawrence Freeman. She had been to hear a talk, and she said she'd never heard anyone talk about prayer like this before. He was in Miami. So I listened, and then I went on to listen to John Main, and I feel like I fell into a practice and an explanation and an understanding that made sense to me immediately in my heart. So there began a long relationship with the community and with Lawrence as a teacher and a friend, because it was a turning point in my career, and I decided that I would go into a period of long retreat in a monastery. And I thought, why not go there? Why not go to Montreal, where the priory was at the time? And so that's what I did. And it's one of those graceful moments in your life where you decide not to follow the very high level theatrical agent that had booked me in New York and Los Angeles, which I think would have been wonderful, but to follow this first. So I did. And so there began a long journey of belonging to and working with a community that is helping others discover meditation, just like I did. And the joy of doing that. And it's within that I realized that it was good to work with people through movement and touch. And that's because when I was at the Priory, I met Mary Stewart, very well-known European yoga teacher, originally in the Iyengar circles, but then she met Vanda Scaravelli, and that's when I met her. And so I started to help other people practice yoga, and I started to think about it and to look at the relationship between yoga and meditation. And then within the world community, I started to teach retreats or help retreats have a bodywork component to them. And I have to say that was a founding step in the way that I later went and studied and filtered what I was learning and what I was wanting to do through bodywork, because I naturally linked the body aspect to the meditation aspect, which I think is how we find it in yoga and how we find it in Tai Chi. So yeah, so that's the world community. And over the years, I've played lots of different roles and helped in lots of different things. I was one of the founding people in New Harmony when the world community was being established. And at that time, I crazily said that I would help launch the publishing company, Media. I did that, and I've helped on the guiding board and so on. And at the moment, I'm my partner and I have moved to France to help set up Bonneau, which is going to be both a retreat center and a place where community is experimented all around the rhythm of meditating together, more in solitude or more in community or more in running the retreat center. These different levels of silence are being worked out. It's a big, not very easy, but very simple project, very complex, very, very simple project that is challenging all of our practices in a wonderful way, actually. So that's the world community. And there was a period of my engagement in all the work that I was doing where I realized that I actually wanted to deepen what I was playing with when I was teaching people yoga. And so I started to study. I'd already been working, helping people in groups and privately for quite a long time. So I studied to become a Rolfer. Rolfing is a form of bodywork that was initiated by Ida Rolf, who was an American biochemist. And on the wonderful and very experimental premise at the time that we're not just a musculoskeletal mechanism that somehow stumbles along in gravity, but actually we are a tensegrity structure, which is held together within a container under hydrostatic forces and pressures. With hard elements, which we call bones, and different other forms of softness, which we call membrane and organ and muscle and so on, tendon. And at the time, that was considered very unscientific and not very, very frou-frou. But actually now Tensegrity is a byword in the work of the study of human movement and human verticality and human function. And a lot of that has been pioneered, in fact, by the Rolf Institute, who's been doing all this work on fascia, especially the work of Robert Schleip. If you're interested, Google him. He's an incredible researcher on the nature of the fascial web of the body, but also of how the tensegrity structure works. And that's been coupled by the groundbreaking work of people like Drakovetsky, who have been studying human movement in detail and solving riddles that could never be solved before because they weren't taking into this mass with all its forces. They were just looking at bones and muscles, and their computations were not working. So, because we're a lot more water and a lot more mass on the front of us, for even more when you live in France, it gets more and more big, the mass on the front. So, so I started to study, and I went to Rolfing because I remember choosing this at university when I had both body pain and psychological growing pain, and I was wondering what to do. And I met some people who had been Rolfed, and I loved the way they talked about the whole nature of dealing with someone, not through only telling your psychological story, which is a beautiful thing, but also through touch and through guiding through touch, and then through observation and languaging of what was arising after the touching, how I felt, how I stood, how I moved. So that's what led me into Rolfing. And then, I opened a practice, and I've been working all these years. And one thing I never accounted for was I thought I would work a lot with people with joint pain and a lot with people with psychological, spiritual pain. But a big part of my London urban practice very quickly became people who had shut down because they had been overwhelmed by a series of things or one thing or a historical thing in their life, often very contemporary thing. So forms of abuse, forms of impact with cars and falls, but impacts of a nature that really caused the system to either completely shut down or to shut down in the other way, which is to become hysterical. And yeah, I think that's significant, and maybe we'll come to that. But it's significant because it took me even further into, also with my meditation practice, into understanding how deeply, organically, we are embedded in a world, and how unlike an object we are. That we are, all our elements are embedded in and with each other. They are nested within each other in the body. Even the head doesn't sit here. The head nests deep into the thoracic cage. And we nest in gravity, and we nest on a ground, and we nest in each other's regard. We're embedded. And so to, treat a shoulder pain as a mechanical thing, although you have to be a good mechanic, there is a biology there, and there is a reality to that joint, but there is a world around that joint which causes it to function well or not to function well, or to degrade over time. So I started to study the work of Hubert Goddard, who is a pioneer in how the human being keeps tone in the world, how it builds its posture, how it understands the world through the lens of this posture that moves in a world. So a real genius and a real pioneer in the world of perception and human orienting capacities in relation to what they're getting back or putting out. And then I did a lot of visceral studies and things of that nature, but constantly bringing back to something that I want to mention, which is that the more I began to see that we're not this object, and that it's not ever very helpful to moralize about this thing, to make it the land of all these sins, and there they are, all written out for you in the Bible. And then if you're just good and you don't do all these body sins, it's all going to be okay. The more I saw, working with people who were overwhelmed and their health was off, and it wasn't just about fixing a shoulder or also just about telling a story. It was about beginning to find a way to help this person evoke a new orientation for the whole person in gravity. And we can talk more about what I mean by orientation. But what was I saying? Yes, that the more you discover that we are an organism which is embedded in an organism, which is the world, and we're embedded in our mutual regard and our relationships and how we make meaning and how we establish contact. The more I began to see that a lot of biology was talking about this, new forms of biology or new views on science. For example, embryology, through the work of Blechschmidt, was starting to show us how embryological formation is not something that's just set somewhere in your genes, but it's actually a very profound response to life around you. That's how cells develop, and that's how the organism, the embryo, the embryology of the organism develops, and that it doesn't stop when you're born. It's like we are an embryological unfolding through life, and then we die. And that's on every level, including the fact that organs are forming, and you have a kidney up here and it goes down and all the organs are turning inside, and the fascia is developing, and the cranium is forming, and the brain and lung and the heart, they're all coming into position and moving and beating in relation to each other. as we prepare to come out, and then it continues. Our legs keep forming until around year 8 in terms of their shape, and then the bones until you're 25. And so if we see that, we start to see how the body has always been telling us that the moral view is never going to work, that it's a wisdom, compassion, an embryological unfolding in the eyes of God, let's say. The unfolding is wisdom, compassion, not do it right or do it wrong, go to hell or go to heaven. And so then I started to see that we are impacted by life, and then very quickly we have symptoms and we think something's wrong with me, and we never go back to this organic thing because we're told it's a machine. So we go and we fix the shoulder and we operate and we take a pill, all of which could be good. But we never, very often, we're not led back to finding out what happened in the garden. What happened in the garden of the body? Not like I know what happened, but tracing where the river runs and where it was dammed or where the tree fell over, and beginning to allow the body, and it does it very quickly, to come towards healing. And I think that's, you know, how we come to our theme, the relationship of trauma to the body, which has become a very, very popular theme these days.
I imagine trauma or trauma experience, which has caused some kind of major issue, and I think maybe we can continue here. What is real trauma? What trauma is? What is your perspective? I believe there is many opinions on that topic, but what is basically trauma to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, to say that there are wonderful people who are, you know, studying this in depth, and it's very easy to find their work, Van der Kolk and Babette Rothschild. But one of the seminal founders of a re-understanding of what trauma is a man called Peter Levine. And his work he named his work Somatic Experiencing. And he's really one of the founding thinkers of a new post-60s view of trauma, because trauma was imagined as almost like an object that you swallowed. You know, you swallowed your father's abuse. You swallowed that thing. And now, if you smash that chair and, you know, and vomit it out, it'll come out because you swallowed it. It's in your muscle memory somewhere. And that's a very, I think it might be helpful to get going, but it's a very unsatisfactory image of what happens to these embedded beings in a world. So trauma is not an object that we pursue and we find, we turn all the furniture over and then we find it and then we got it and then we throw it away, or we take it to the clinic and it gets cleaned. It isn't at all like that. And in fact, the more you treat it that way, the more you wound yourself. The more you tell that about you, the more you say, I was in that terrible accident and I could see it and I could see it, you know, the more you underline that you are this abandoned person, this abused person, this terrible accident person, this war-torn person, the more you underline it, actually, the more you encase it in the nervous system, which is trying to actually digest it and move on. And so the more we turn it into an object, in a sense, the more we swallow. And so trauma is, it's not really like that. Trauma is the outcome of natural events or unnatural events, the outcome of the fact that often the wave of experience is very big, and we need to deal with it. Very often we do. You know, being born or giving birth is a huge experience for the mother and the child. And very often they survive and they're not traumatized by the hugeness of this. Same when somebody dies. It's huge for them and it's huge for us. And very often, because we're resilient and we have a family around us, we make it through and actually we discover that we're growing. Trauma, we could label, is that event which was too much, came too soon, came too quickly, was unexpected, caught us, and impacted, and did not allow us to then complete something. The tsunami, the earthquake, the car accident, the abuse, or repeated things. And these impacts they don't need to be, cataclysmic. They can be small. A child that's really embarrassed in front of the whole class by a teacher may be working on that seemingly small experience for a long time in their life. What happens is, to make it simple, that when we undergo this impact, the natural biological response is threefold. We can get away from it, we can fight it and repel it, or if we don't have those two choices, we freeze. And we see this in nature. And if you look up the work of Peter Levine online, you will see he takes you through and he shows you how in the wild antelope that are being overwhelmed by a lion freeze and just fall paralyzed. And what that means in the wild is that the predator needs a reaction in order to go towards the meal. And if there's no reaction, very often the prey is left. And then you can see the prey gets up. And animals in the wild are never traumatized because either they get eaten or they don't get eaten. And if they don't get eaten, they're not traumatized. They get up, they quickly bounce around and urinate and shiver, and then they're back to normal. Their nervous systems are back to normal. They're not meaning, they're not journaling about what just happened to them, okay, to the therapist, because they're going to be attacked again, maybe in the next 5 minutes. So they're back. We don't do this when we freeze. We don't do this recovery process because we're social beings and we've been trained not to embarrass ourselves and others and to, boys don't cry, and to get it all together very quickly. So we don't complete this process. So what happens is the immobilization event couples with the freezing immobilization event couples with the fear moment. And that causes the nervous system to use a huge amount of energy to contain this. And so after that, our behavior is impaired. Instead of having normal behavior where we can get excited and fall asleep, get angry and get peaceful, and live a rich autonomic life, it becomes impaired, and we can't go over and we can't go under because there's something there, which is that old event which hasn't. And so that's the trauma trace in the body, which is the coupling of fear and immobility and the amount of energy that the system needs to use to keep you in place so that you can be a functioning adult in your family and at work.
Okay.
It's not an object.
Okay. So maybe it could be worth to mention here what are the symptoms in the body when there is a trauma. So what is the connection between the body and trauma, really?
Yeah. On the large scale, I would say that first of all, we should be able to regulate, to come back to normal relatively easily. So if something pisses us off or frightens us, and then we should be able to come back, relatively quickly to get on to the next task. So the capacity for self-regulation is a sign that the system is whole and ordinary goodness of life is going on. When an adult who is, high functioning, very loving, very beloved of their family or at work, starts to report that from time to time they have behavior that really surprises them and it's embarrassing to them, we know that whatever it was trips a switch and causes the nervous system to go outside of its tightened range, and so funny behavior shows up. And often it's repeated and it damages relationships, or they go look for therapy, and also then starts to show up with physical symptoms. Of course, if you've had a strong traumatic impact, like a car impact, you're going to have physical symptoms from the beginning. So our capacity to self-regulate is very important within the field of social engagement. Now, the symptoms of not being able to self-regulate are many. Often the person begins to shiver and gets very cold. Their skin no longer looks warm, and it goes very pale. They start to have a tingly, vibratory feeling around the lips, around the nostrils, around the eyes, the fingertips. So in my practice, I could tell very quickly that this was starting to happen, and so I would back off. So other symptoms are needing to yawn, needing to rush off often to the toilet. Symptoms where the body is suddenly has a bit of a volcanic thing going underground, and you're trying to be. Then more long-term negative symptoms are that we start to have bad digestion. We start to have very uncomfortable sensations in the chest, and we start to have, not good sleep. Then we have to see whether the trauma has bottomed a person out. So it has really, the abuse has really crashed them. And so systems that are bottomed out have a quality about them. Or if this traumatic thing has sent a person into hyperactivity, and they have another quality, and those are also symptoms that, and sometimes what is not being dealt with, and it starts to be labeled as bipolar or, I would say, So there are things we can see. The body looks different. Speakers in public get that feeling of their throat goes dry, and then they relax because they're used to doing that, speaking in public. But that's like the beginning of something that starts to roll and you can't control. Those are the symptoms of resident undigested overwhelm. Then there are symptoms of a person who's actually beginning to recover their missing gesture, the unfinished gesture. And these are very beautiful. They show up in therapeutic situations where you're working with the trauma very, very slowly and in a good way. You're not re-traumatizing the person. That person begins to recover the capacity to go through what happened in a biological, gestural way. It may be accompanied by narrative, but it doesn't need to be. Some of these things are pre-verbal.
Okay, great. And okay, that leads us to question, how can we work with trauma? How do we involve the body in the healing process? I don't think it's not just about our minds.
No, it's not in the mind. The mind that is tripping over these things is a symptom of something that has impacted the body. And I use the word impact properly on purpose, because our bodies, our earthenware vessels that are the home of the spirit, who's telling us that we are beloved, these bodies sometimes to us seem very vulnerable and breakable and perishable, which they are, but at the same time, they are indomitable. And bodies can receive huge impacts, impacts to the heart, emotional impacts, huge losses, huge overwhelming gains, and also physical impacts. The body is capable of absorbing quite high impacts. This is what happens in a car. And the cranium, with all its many, many, many little bones, is made for that. All the bones move in relation to each other so that this impact can ricochet all the way through the body and that person might survive. So impact, but I forgot what the question was.
Was how we do involve the body into the healing process?
Yeah. So I would say there are 3 levels, and it doesn't matter where you start. I think the more you work with people, the more you realize where that person and I, should be starting. And those 3 ways of working need to take place in a context. And the context, the first step of the context is safety. So this is a complex thing because it's a word and it means lots of things to lots of people. But if the person who is looking to resolve this or digest this or heal this hasn't been signaled to by the other, whether it be a friend or a spiritual director or a trauma therapist, that safety is the first step, both will rush into something and discover that they're unprepared. And safety happens in lots of different ways, but usually by the friend or the therapist listening and signaling that listening is happening. And we signal this by the spaciousness of our response, by the way that we are repeating what's being said in order to incorporate it, the way that we repeat gestures that are being made, the way that we mimic with our breath and our bodies, the vulnerability that the other person is bringing. And I find that very, very beautiful. And we do that. We all know how to do that. What it does is it creates the milieu for something to take place, which I'm jumping maybe to other questions you want to ask, but that's what I understand is happening in meditation.
Yeah, let's continue with that. Obviously you described the harmony with the body and the spirit in meditation. So what is the connection for you?
What I find foundational in John Main in his teaching on meditation is that he reminds us that the time of meditation and the discipline that we decide to embark on in meditation, he reminds us that we are doing something extraordinary, but it's not something that the egoic part of ourselves is used to thinking about when we think about relationship or healing or getting what I want or saying thank you. He reminds us that we are deciding to honor this extraordinary invitation, which boggles the mind and the heart, that the divine reality, that love, is inviting us to sit in love's presence and to learn to sit more and more unprotectedly, more and more in attendance to the beloved and the beloved's regard. And of course, then he goes to show how absolute that invitation is. But you know, when we talk about the body or healing, or we talk about asceticism in Christianity or Buddhism, I think that the key is there. You know, the key in the Buddhist or Christian theology or way of talking about it is there, that we're not doing or getting or fixing something. We're just coming on a date. We're coming on a date, and the beloved is going to kiss us on the mouth. But it's when we think about the body, we so quickly go away from that. But actually, that's what two beloveds do. They get naked and they make love in a field or wherever. So when you, so to go back to your question about, you know, how do we work on trauma or heal trauma? It's that intimate, really. And it's that vulnerable, and it's that extraordinary, that this person is going to make themselves naked because they're desperate to fix this, you know, thing that keeps taking off in their lives. And together you attend to this through the first gate, which is safety, poverty of spirit. And then there are three areas that need to be attended to. We need to see if there was a physical impact, you know, what the reality of that impact was. Then we need to understand how the psychological thing is unfolding. And of course, personally, I feel that there is a component of the spirit there. There is a component of the spirit, which is a very deep upwelling towards health, which lives in every person, lives in every person. And they need to find that. It's not something we find, or I or a friend finds for them. They through the contact and the work that happens, find that. In terms of physical or psychological impact, space, like I said, is important. The safety, the context. It's tricky because the person who comes to the therapist needs to find a kind of equality with the therapist in the transference before the touch happens. But there's also a timing question. So if the impact is very recent, it's probably better to wait a bit. You know, if a person has had a terrible car accident and they come right away to you and you touch their neck, you're still part of the car accident. So there is a discernment that needs to happen about when to intervene and then how to go deeper or how to go to the next level. It's difficult with the spiritual component, but one thing I feel very strongly about is this, that although it's very important to be able to tell your story, and people who find that they behave weirdly because something gets tripped up, they find it hard to talk about it because it's shameful and embarrassing. But also people who have been abused very often tried to tell the story and they were told that they were not believed, which is a second very profound traumatizing. So of course it's very important to find the way to begin to speak through word and gesture, even when it's a preverbal thing. But what happens is the error happens when the telling continues too long. Because the telling of the story is very important and foundational, but it's not the essence. The missing gesture is the essence. That moment where the gesture wasn't completed, you couldn't say, stop, I don't want that, or, oh my God, there's a car coming. So we can't talk our way into that because it is actually a gesture. So I feel that movement work, which has been very ignored in medical science in a way, apart from repetitive reconstruction of muscle work by physiotherapists, but movement work, which helps people recover orientation. This is it's meta psychological because it is a pure gesture. So it transcends the narrative. And that's why in meditation, that's what we're doing. We're making a meta gesture by sitting still and putting our attention in one place and stopping to think about ourselves. So there is something that leads towards that in the movement work. And it's growing in the world of therapy, and that we need to know how to language, and then we need to know when the body needs to understand what was languaged and then begin to make its gesture. And the good partner in the dance, the therapist or friend, is simply there to attend, simply there to attend this moment. And in the healings, in the Bible, for example, we see this, you know. If you can, you will heal me. There he is with the withered hand or the leprosy. And then there is a context. Sometimes the person is taken out of the town. Sometimes the person is brought into the middle of the group. Whatever is needed to release what was shut down. Put your hand out, and then the arm is made whole. And then there is a closure to this, which is go back into the world where everything's shut down. Yeah. And that's I think that's often what we mean by spiritual or spirituality. Bigger than biology, but not discounting biology.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. It was a pleasure to be with you.